Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our presentation on client identification and verification rules. This presentation is for the Law Society of the Yukon, and I wanted to start by thanking you to making the time to listen to us. Um, my name is Gustavo, and we are a small accounting firm in Calgary, Alberta. We provide all the accounting services, which is taxation, bookkeeping, assurance. We also do forensic accounting and litigation support. And we have been going to Whitehorse to the Law Society of the Yukon for the past several years doing trust audits. And we also do that as well for the Law Society of Alberta. Mm. Today, I'm here with Sarah, Jaden, and Stephen, which are also accountants here at SGLLP in Calgary. And our agenda today will consist of, we're going to start with prohibitions and conditions. Then we're going to jump into client identification. We're going to go through client verification. Lastly, we're going to talk about anti-money laundering rules, especially to cash transactions. And finally, we're going to address questions. I would like to remind everybody to please mute your computers. If you have questions, there is a chat, and Sarah is going to be monitoring the chat. So you're welcome and free to post your questions or wait to the end, and we can address the questions personally. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this to Jaden, who will start with prohibitions and conditions.
Thanks, Gustavo. So for starters, we're going to take a look at four important areas that you should consider when complying with the prohibitions and conditions of operating a trust account. The main point that we want to drive home here is that you, the lawyer, when you're receiving funds into trust, they're for a legitimate legal purpose and that you're using those funds for that said purpose. So for starters, the first section to touch on here is having a legal document. So the first area here is having some sort of document detailing the legal services that are being provided, the scope, and any specific client instructions involved in the file. This is very important and can vary depending on the type of services that you're providing. So whether it be real estate, a criminal matter, a family matter, it can always vary depending on the type of service. Also, having a legal document also avoids any ambiguity and expectations that the client may have of the services that you're providing. And from an auditor perspective, this cuts down on any confusion when we're looking through the client trust ledger and we're seeing where funds are being paid out to, that we have an understanding that the things are legitimate and there's no red flags. But as a general rule, we strongly recommend that you use a retainer at every matter that you are representing. Second section we're going to touch on here is the deposits. So these are funds that are going into trust. Very important, only accept trust funds into trust. Don't put other funds that are not related to trust. Some situations just to know when not to deposit funds into trust. These are funds that may belong entirely to you, the member, or other members of the law firm. So for example, these could be personal funds, as well as funds received by the member on account for fees where a billing has been rendered. These must go to general and should not flow through trust, as well as funds to reimburse the member for disbursements and expenses incurred on the behalf of a client. Again, these funds must go to general, do not flow them through trust. Now we're going to talk a bit about withdrawals from trust. So when withdrawing funds from trust, you should only do it under the following circumstances. So it is required for payment to or on behalf of a client. So if a client directed you to pay funds to let's say a seller in a real estate transaction, that would be one of those situations where you'd pay to someone on behalf of a client. It's required to reimburse yourself, the member, for disbursements or expenses incurred on behalf of the client for which billing has been rendered. It's required for payment of your member's fees for which billing has been rendered. It's directly transferred into another trust account and held on behalf of that client. But we see this quite common across audits when lawyers have multiple trust accounts at different banks. For whatever reason, sometimes the lawyers or the client prefer to have the funds in the bank in which maybe they bank with. And last but not least, if the amount was paid into trust account by mistake. I just want to highlight here that if at any time you, the member, discover that money was mistakenly withdrawn from trust, you must immediately deposit the amount that was mistakenly withdrawn. And additionally, you must report this to the executive director using the Form 17, specifying the amount that you mistakenly withdrew and the circumstances surrounding that withdrawal. And the last section we're going to touch on here is the ongoing monitoring. So when you have the business relationship with your client, it is required of you on a periodic basis to assess whether the client's actions and the information they're providing is consistent with the legal agreement that was signed. This can be critical for assessing any likelihood of fraudulent activity. For example, let's say Joe wants a real estate transaction. He gives you money for the purchase, but then Joe starts directing you to transfer funds to unrelated people or organizations or asks you to do things outside of the legal agreement. That should raise red flags for you. And that is it for the monitoring. Now we're going to jump into a couple scenarios and just test your knowledge on some of the stuff that we just talked about. For the first scenario, the lawyer provided legal services to their client, Sally, and issued an invoice for the services rendered. Sally provided a check to the lawyer for the invoiced amount. The lawyer then deposited the check into trust and then transferred the amount to general for payment of services. We ask that you please use that chat section, just kind of commenting in there whether or not you think this was in compliance. I'll just give you guys a minute here.
You could also use your hand raise button to, if you're in agreement that it's compliant.
So I see one comment in there from Chris, not compliant. See a bunch of the hand motions. Another one from Luke also stating not in compliance. Okay, we're getting a couple responses in here. Perfect. And we'll just pull up the result here now. So it is not compliant. And the reason for non-compliance is that even though the bill was issued to Sally and the services were rendered, this should not go into trust. Should go straight into your general account. Do not flow it through trust. Now we're going to touch on a second scenario here. So the lawyer's client, Jim, provided a check that was deposited into the trust's bank account for legal services to be completed. During the agreement, the lawyer dispersed funds from the general bank account on behalf of the client. The lawyer transfers funds from the trust account to the general account to reimburse themselves for the dispersed funds. Was this in compliance? And again, please use the chat and raise your hands to give your opinion. Good, getting some responses in here. I'm seeing a lot of non-compliance. Just give it another 10 or 15 seconds. Okay, perfect. I'm seeing a lot of agreement on non-compliance. So the result here is you guys are correct, non-compliance. There's no issue with the fact that you, the lawyer, needs to be reimbursed for the dispersed funds. The problem was there was no billing rendered to the client for these dispersed funds before the amount was paid into the general. Key takeaways here. Have documentation, please, please, please. We can't stress enough to have a retainer agreement detailing the scope of services and any client instructions so that it avoids any confusion on the client's end or expectations of services you're going to provide, or from the auditor's perspective, when we're looking at the client trust ledger at the transactions that are taking place, that it all makes sense in compliance with the legal agreement. Now I'm going to pass it off to Stephen, who's going to talk a little bit about client identification.
Perfect. All right, thanks, Shaden. So yeah, we're gonna dive into client identification, specifically who we need to identify and when we need to identify them. So obviously, you have to identify your client whenever you're retained to provide legal services. We suggest that you do that identification at the same time that they're signing your retainer agreement, just so it's done and dusted right up front. Additionally, though, you also need to identify any third parties providing trust funds or instructions related to that specific matter. Okay. There's a couple exceptions that apply to this. So, for example, if you're in-house counsel for your employer, you wouldn't need to perform identification. If you're acting as an agent for another lawyer who's already identified the client, if you're acting for a client who's been referred to you by another lawyer who's already identified the client, then you wouldn't have to. So, for example, if a client that was with Jaden, let's say, decides not to use the services anymore, Jaden transfers the retainer funds to my law firm, I wouldn't necessarily need to re-identify that client. And the other exception being when you are providing legal services as part of a duty counsel program sponsored by a nonprofit organization, unless the legal service involves a financial transaction, like a real estate purchase. The big thing here, though, so for those 2 points, when you're kind of relying on another lawyer providing the identification, get a copy of the identification they performed. You still have to retain that within your client file. Yeah, so don't necessarily just rely on word of mouth that identification's been performed. Ask the lawyer for that copy of identification. Now, a couple common scenarios. Let's say Melissa and Bob are buying a house together. Um, a separate identification sheet would need to be done for each person, even if, let's say, Melissa is sort of your main point of contact, because they're both the client and they're both able to instruct related to that matter. A separate identification sheet would need to be filled out for each person. Same thing or similarly, I guess, if the same person is a client for multiple different matters of yours. So let's say is your client. He bought a house. Then later down the line, Jaden gets divorced and he retains your firm again. You wouldn't necessarily need to re-identify him, but you would need to copy that previous identification from the first file over into that new file. And then with that, obviously, if you know things have changed, like their address has changed, their employment, anything like that has changed, then it would be a good idea to redo it. So you do want it to be somewhat current. Um, okay. So what do we need to record? I guess the big thing too, a common misconception with that we see among members across Canada is they think identification is just scanning an ID card. Identification has to be a separate form that's used solely for the purpose of identification, and it must be retained within the client file. Getting a copy of the ID, that's more verification, and Jaden's going to touch on that a little bit later. But identification is that form specifically for the purpose of identifying. And yeah, if you're identifying an individual, well, what do we need? We need obviously the client's full name. We'll need the client's home address and home phone telephone number. We'll need the client's occupation or occupations if there's multiple, and the address and telephone number of the client's place of work or employment. Just for further clarity, occupation doesn't necessarily need to be employment. So you could be retired, a student, a stay-at-home parent, anything like that. That would constitute occupation. So you would throw that in the line. Bottom line, though, you don't want anything to be left blank. So let's say somebody's unhoused, so they don't necessarily have a home address. You would put NA, not applicable, client is unhoused. But you at least have to do that due diligence of filling in every piece on that identification form. Now, on the corporate side, well, what do we need to record? Well, we need the client's full name, so that would be if the corporation's your client, you would want their full legal business name. You'll need their business address and business telephone number. You're going to want the organization's business number and the place of its incorporation. So if it's incorporated in Alberta, let's say, you're going to want to make a note of that. You want to know the general nature of the type of business or the business's activities. And you also need the name, position, and contact information, for the individual who is authorized to give instruction to you, the member, for the given matter. Just for further clarity, contact information includes everything required to identify an individual. So if you've got a corporate client, you need to do identification on the corporation. And then let's say the CEO or the president is the one instructing you on the matter. You also need to do individual identification on that person as well. And again, same thing with individuals. Nothing on that form should be left blank. Okay, so we're gonna move just into a client identification form example here. And so this template is actually taken directly from the LSA's website, and we'll sort of talk about some resources that you can use near the end here. But let's say you're the auditor and you're auditing SG law firm or law office, sorry, and you decide to pull Sidney Crosby's client file, and you're testing for identification here. This is what SG's law office has provided you. And so it's kind of listed A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. Wherever you see a violation, just sort of based off of what I've talked about, if you want to just throw that in the chat. And I'll give it a couple minutes here for some responses to come in. Hockey player for the Penguins, yeah. And Team Canada, heartbreak in the Olympics, but we won't go there today. Um, okay, so yeah, that's right. Okay, so obviously A, full legal name, Sydney C isn't acceptable. We would accept Sidney Crosby in sort of that case. Then obviously residential phone number is left blank. Even if he doesn't have a phone number, we would still want to see something like not applicable, client only has cell phone. And lastly, the business address isn't completed. It just says PPG Paints Arena. It needs to be a proper mailing address. We'd want the street number, postal code, those sorts of things. Okay. Switching to another sort of scenario. Let's say your client's Cora and they're currently in jail. Her mother, Melissa, provides you with $20,000 or a $20,000 retainer to cover legal fees and bail. In this situation, who would you need to identify? And I'll give a couple minutes here just to get some more uh, responses in the chat for the scenario on the screen here. Yeah, so the vast majority here that said both, you are correct. You need to identify Cora, obviously, because that's your client. Then you also need to identify Melissa, the third party providing funds as well. You want to know who's putting money into your trust account. And then one more scenario, sort of relating to a corporate situation. So ABC Ltd is a corporate client looking to purchase a new office condo in downtown Whitehorse. Susan's the CEO, and that's your primary point of contact for the transaction. You receive $150,000 from ABC Ltd. You get $500,000 from the Royal Bank of Canada for the mortgage, and $50,000 from Elliot, the CFO of ABC Inc. In this sort of situation, who would you need to identify as their lawyer? And I'll give a couple moments here again in the chat. So yeah, getting a lot of good responses here. So you first and foremost need to identify your client, which is ABC Ltd. You then need to identify Susan, who's the individual that's able to instruct on behalf of the corporation. And then you also need to identify Elliot, because for some reason, Elliot, the CFO, is providing funds personally for this purchase of the property. So we need to identify those three. I saw some people put in the chat RBC. As a financial institution, you don't need to identify RBC. So we see that a lot with real estate transactions where you'll get mortgage proceeds from a bank or a financial institution. You don't need to identify the banks in that situation. And I'll pass it back over to Jaden, who's going to walk through the exciting world of client verification.
So for the client verification, this is sort of the second step in the whole entirety of the CIV process. It's not always required, but we will touch on that later in some of the slides. So for starters, when is client verification required? So upon engaging in or giving any instructions in respect of receiving, paying, or transferring funds. Two, we're going to talk on whose identity do we need to verify. So pull up for a second. So when you're identifying the client and verifying that identity, if it's an individual client, you're going to verify that said individual or individuals if it's multiple people on the matter. If it's an organizational client being a company, you're going to have to verify the details of that, maybe using something along the lines of a corporate search. We'll touch on that in the next slide, as well as you need to verify the individuals who are authorized to provide and give instructions on behalf of that organization. Thirdly, we're going to talk about what must be verified. So in this next step, you must verify the information about the source of funds coming into trust. So this could be a myriad of things. So let's say maybe it's a client that, maybe it's just a client that's just employed. So maybe it'd be something like savings or checkings or something of that nature, but it could be anything from settlement proceeds, lottery winnings. Maybe they got a loan from their mother or friend that they're providing to you to pay for the services. It's important that you record the information about that because that's sort of the economic activity behind the service to pay for the fees and to pay for the disbursements and to pay for anything that's involved in the legal agreement. Second is you would want to have for organizations, you would want to have the names of all directors of that organization. And third, you would want to have the names and addresses of all beneficial owners of the organization that are equal to or greater than 25%. Next, we're going to touch on what sort of source documents are required when verifying an individual or an organizational client. To start, when it comes to an individual client, what's expected of you, the lawyer, to verify that client would be something along the lines, and what we see to be the most common would be a government-issued ID that would contain the individual's name and photograph. And very important to note here, because we've seen this on lots of files, it must be current and valid. If it's expired, that is no good. You must get something that is current and valid. Another option would be to have something from a Canadian credit file, 3+ years, containing the name, address, and date of birth of the client. And thirdly, you could have something along the lines from reliable sources that contain two of the following. So a name, an address, date of birth, deposit account, credit card, or other loan amount with a financial institution. That's not a common one that we see, but it is an option for you. Next, we're going to touch on the organizational clients and the source documents that you would need for them. The most common one that we would see would be the certificate of corporate status issued by a public body. So maybe incorporation documents, maybe a copy from a public body requiring, confirming the requirement for that company to file annually. So maybe you also get something from the CRA or something from a provincial registry office, something of that nature. Or maybe a copy of a similar record from a public body confirming the organization's existence, or a copy of constating documents confirming its existence. We're going to touch on a few scenarios here, just to hammer home here. So in situations where maybe you're meeting virtually with a client, like an individual, and you never actually meet face to face with them to discuss the legal agreement that's being executed. In situations where you are wary of the ID that the client has provided, there are third-party verification companies that can check the IDs for anything that may be fake or fraudulent. Next here, we're going to touch on some of the areas in where you would be exempt from verifying said clients. So one, if the client is a financial institution, public body, or reporting issuer, you do not have to verify that client. Kind of going back to when Stephen was talking about the identification of, let's say, RBC being a financial institution, you don't need to verify that as well. When it comes to the source of funds, some exemptions would be if the funds were paid by or to a financial institution, public body, or reporting issuer, if the funds were received from the trust account of another lawyer, if the funds were received from a peace officer, a law enforcement agency, or some sort of public official acting in their official capacity. It's paid or received to pay a fine, penalty, or bail, so more common in criminal matters, or paid or received for professional fees, disbursement, or expenses. So if the funds are coming straight into your trust account, they're only going to be used to pay your fees and to not be transferred around to execute the legal matter that you're representing. You don't need to verify the identity of the client. But as a rule, we always encourage you, generally speaking, to verify the organization or the individual. It doesn't hurt to go the extra mile. Now we're going to touch on some scenarios just to test the knowledge of the stuff that we just went over, if the law firm would be in compliance with verification or not. So the first scenario we're going to touch on here, Amanda walked into the law firm and engaged the firm for legal services regarding a criminal matter. Amanda provided a retainer of $2,000 that is to be used towards professional fees charged on account. The law firm did not verify the ID of Amanda. Was this in compliance? Just going to give you guys a couple minutes to chime in the chat, maybe use the hand raise motion to give your responses. So we're just going to pull up the result here now. So in this situation, the law firm is in compliance. The reasoning being is that all the funds that were brought into trust were used exclusively to pay for the professional fees of the lawyer. And as we just discussed in the prior slide for exemptions, that is not required when it comes to verification if it's exclusively for fees for the member. We're going to touch on the second scenario below. Let's say, and just before we go further in this scenario, I just want to say it's inferred that Hamandeep and Gurpreet are the only directors and beneficial owners of the organization. So Hamandeep and Gurpreet own a small building company and have engaged a law firm for legal services on a real estate transaction. Hamandeep is the president and Gurpreet is the vice president, who are both authorized to instruct the lawyer on the matter. The company provided a retainer of $50,000 to be used towards professional fees and the purchase of vacant land. The law firm has verified the company details and the ID of Hamandeep since he is the president. Was this in compliance or non-compliant? Just give you a couple minutes or a minute here just to chime in and say, give your opinion. So were they in compliance or were they in non-compliance for verification? So far I'm seeing 3 non-compliance, 4, 5. Seems to be a consensus. Perfect. We're just going to pull up the result here. So even though the law firm did verify the ID of Hamandeep and the company, they were still required to verify the identity of Gurpreet because he is also authorized to instruct the lawyer on the matter. And just to touch on some key takeaways here for the CIV, Sarah's just going to chime in and let you know some of the key takeaways.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Jaden. So key takeaways, like Jaden started off saying, is client identification is the collection of the information so that you know who you're working with, dealing with, receiving funds from. And so this is the completion of a separate form or activity to collect the information specifically for the anti-money laundering client identification rule. We hear from members quite often on audits that you know this information. It's somewhere in your file. It's probably in multiple places in your file. The rules require you to perform a specific activity for this purpose to collect that information in a single spot. And so that's where a separate form is required. There is not a required format for that. What you're required to do is collect the information in the rules. And then client verification is the next step of verifying or getting evidence over the information that is in that form. So that is where the step where you would take copies of IDs, you would perform the corporate searches, you would get your due diligence information on the activities that Jaden indicated for you. I will bring up just briefly here, there is a form available on the Law Society of Yukon website, and we'll provide the link at the end of our presentation. But there is a form available that is very fulsome and covers off the different processes or needs if you have an individual client, and there's a second form for if you have an organizational client. If you are in a practice where you are really only identifying clients and you don't ever have the scenario where you need to verify, you can have a much shorter version of this form that just covers parts 1 and 2 identified on the form I've brought up on the screen. And again, this is available on the Law Society of Yukon's website. The form continues on to have sections for verification of an individual, recording documentation if obtained for ID. Again, if your process is to always use government ID, you can cut the form off here. You don't need to then continue to have the credit file method or the dual ID process method. You can adapt the form so that it works for your practice. And a lot of practices have one or more forms available based on the client situation. If you have a general practice and you're doing real estate with a client and they're bringing in the funds for cash to close, then you will need to ID and verify. So you would have a longer form. But if you're also doing something that might just be a retainer for civil litigation, perhaps, and you're collecting funds only for your fees, then you could have a shorter form for those clients where it's just identification. That is entirely up to you. And again, the form contains that other information that Jaden indicated with collecting source of funds to have that on your file. for the organizational form, I'll just bring that up here. And again, it says right at the top there that this is for the purposes of what we call CIV on an organization. So has the details for the incorporation, as well as that reminder there that we need to collect information on the individual that's authorized to instruct you. And then again, spots for third parties as applicable. So again, if I'm only needing to ID organizations, I could have my form end there. If I'm also in the taking on transactions where perhaps I'm doing real estate work for organizations, then I would have the second part of the form that again has all those details on confirming the existence, what kind of record we've obtained to do that. And then, as Jaden again mentioned, the need to record the beneficial ownership for the organization, and then names, addresses, occupations of those parties with 25% or more, and again, a separate spot for directors and officers of the organization. And then continuing down, there's information on, again, beneficial ownership, and verifying identity of the senior managing officer of the entity, source of funds. So the forms are meant to be exhaustive to allow that opportunity to collect all the information. But again, that form is not required. What's required is for you to apply the identification and verification rules as they apply to your clients in your practice. And I'll just pause for a quick moment to touch on one of the, or a couple of questions that came up in the chat, and we're not avoiding answering them, but just when in doubt, definitions of what is a public body? What is a reporting issuer? The very fulsome definition is contained in the rules and should be your point of reference to make sure you're catching all those instances. One of the earlier questions was, what about a Yukon First Nations investment corporation, a Yukon First Nation, and as any First Nations, they're defined as well under public body. And then there was an earlier question about insurers and what's a reporting issuer. So you'll see that those fall under those definitions. Okay, I will pass it back to the team here.
Sarah, maybe just real quick too, just with identification and verification. If a client of your law firm is sort of refusing to have their ID taken or refusing to provide certain information for identification, what would you say the member should do in those sort of situations? Or maybe we put up to the members to, put something in the chat and see what would you do in that situation if a client isn't wanting to provide you with a ID or is sort of dodging the bullet, so to speak, on providing some information on that identification sheet. What would you as a member do?
Feel free to use the chat, or if you'd like to unmute. Thank you, Christiana. Unable to assist, absolutely, is one response. And this gets more into your code of conduct. What the direction from the Federation of Law Societies is that if you cannot complete the client identification and verification process as it is outlined in the rules, is that you should not be working with that client. If, however, there are extenuating circumstances and you have reason to continue on with that client relationship, you'll want to make sure that your file and your documentation includes that reasoning, your professional judgment that was used to do that. Okay. So that's important to note. It is your job as the member to provide the documentation for client identification and verification. I know quite often when you have staff or assistants, others working with you in your law firm, they may be the first point of contact to complete that form. So definitely educating them on what is required of you. And then ultimately, you should be making sure when you're undertaking to start your file that you have that documentation complete and accurate. question in the chat from Peter for identification. Is it acceptable to present the client with the information and ask for confirmation that it is correct and complete? Absolutely. There's nothing in the rules that requires the client to fill out that form. It is your record for your law practice, and what you would like that to look like is entirely up to you. You want to make sure that, again, it includes all the information in the rules. It is a good practice to date that form so that you have a clear notation of when that was collected, and that helps in the future for what Stephen and Jaden mentioned is you can carry this forward. If you're doing ongoing work with the client, that information should be in each of your client files for that particular client, but you can absolutely use a copy. You don't need to redo it every time. But that date will help you reference, oh, wait a minute. That ID was dated this date. I probably need to go back and get that from the client. Or, oh, it's been a couple years since I've met with that client. I should refresh. So just even that a simple for practice of dating the form is very helpful for clearly showing that you did this at the start of the client matter and had it before undertaking to work with that client. Okay. And thank you. So I see some additional comments in the chat, Carla. I like that, that if you don't have that information, you don't assist. And then Deb, there's a question. What is required for client ID and or verification if you do not operate a trust account? So the undertaking is if you are not um, holding trust funds, then you're likely not getting into the verification stage at any point in time because you're not handling funds for the client, but you still would be required to identify the client that you are working with unless it meets one of those exceptions, Deb.
Perfect. Okay, thanks, Sarah. So we're going to switch gears slightly, and we're just going to touch briefly on some anti-money laundering rules related to cash. So overall, you can't receive cash in an aggregate, so total amount greater than $7,500 Canadian. So it's got to be converted into Canadian currency within the same client matter. Now, there are a few exceptions that apply to this. So for example, if the cash comes from a financial institution like RBC, for example, any sort of law enforcement agency, or a public official acting in their official capacity, if the cash is used to pay a fine, penalty, or bail, you can accept more than that $7,500. Or if the cash is just being used for professional fees, disbursements, or expenses, you can also accept more than $7,500 Canadian. The big thing though is any refunds related to cash received must be made in cash. No exceptions. And we'll sort of go through a couple of scenarios near the end relating to that. Now with cash, too, so your trust accounting records, they have to have, or they have to include the method by which money is received in trust for a client. So if you're taking cash in, your trust bank journal should show, usually it shows like source or something like that. It would say cash. So you want, first and foremost, you want that recorded within your accounting software. But additionally, you also have to maintain a separate book of duplicate receipts, for cash. And so each receipt has to have the following. So you need the date the cash is received, the person from whom cash is received from, the amount of the cash received, the client and the applicable matter or file number from whom cash is, or for whom, sorry, cash is received. Then you also need the signature of the person who provided the cash, as well as the signature of the individual authorized to receive cash. And so a big thing, and I've kind of bolded it here, signature means signature. So initials of the person receiving the cash or providing the cash isn't good enough. It's got to actually be their proper signature. Okay? And in this next slide, I'm going to put you back into the mindset of an auditor. This time, we're looking at Connor McDavid's file. I'm an Oilers fan, so bear with me here. But we're looking at Connor McDavid's file, and you're an auditor, and you're testing the cash receipt because you saw on the Trust Bank Journal that $5,000 cash was received on March 4th, 2026. This is a cash receipt that I've provided to you. What sort of violations do we see on this cash receipt based off of what I've gone over on that last slide? I'll give it a couple minutes just for people to pop some answers in the chat here. Perfect. Okay, yeah. So overall, we kind of nailed them all. So first and foremost, there's no matter number here. We just have Connor McDavid putting money in trust, so we don't know which matter it relates to. He could have multiple files going on at the same time. So we need to know which matter that this applies to. The signature of the person that provided funds, in this case, Connor McDavid, isn't sufficient. He just put his initials. We're going to want that autograph. And lastly, there's no signature of the individual authorized to receive cash. So when we say person authorized to receive cash, just for clarity, that doesn't necessarily need to be the member, like the Law Society member. It could be sort of your receptionist, legal assistant, paralegal, whoever it may be, whoever's authorized to accept this cash. It would be their signature applied on that cash receipt. So we're just going to dive into just a couple other just quick scenarios relating to cash here.
I will just pause for 1 second. Sorry, Stephen, to interrupt. Is just what, with respect to getting the signature of the person from whom cash is received, the rules require you to make best efforts here. If you cannot get that, that's okay, and that happens. What you would want to do is document why, what happened that day. And in some cases, we've heard that, you know what, they were in and out really quickly. It's someone I well, know very well, so received it, and my assistant signed the receipt, but we didn't get the signature before handing off the other receipt. Quick note in your file just helps that maintain that, again, documentation. As you may have noted, we're auditors, we like documentation a lot. So you just making a note. Anytime you see that exception there, put it in your file what happened so it's very clear. Sometimes we're auditing way into the future and you can't recall all of those instances depending on how busy your practice is or what was going on at the time. So just that's a quick note to know that it is um, best efforts to get the signature of the person that you're receiving the cash from. Back to Stephen.
Perfect. Yeah, and I guess I should also clarify too with the duplicate receipts. Obviously the person or you would retain one copy, and then the person providing the cash would get to retain that other copy as well. Okay, so just a couple quick scenarios here. So let's say you receive $30,000 of aggregate cash, so total cash in matter number 2026. You bill your client, Sean, for $18,000 worth of legal fees and disbursements. And as you prepare his refund, Sean asks that an $8,000 check be made out to a numbered corporation registered in British Columbia. He then says that he's out of the country and would like the remaining $4,000 sent to him via EFT, electronic fund transfer. Is this something you as a member can do? Yeah, cash only. Yeah, so the answer is no, we can't do that. It's got to go back to Sean in cash. The rules are quite clear. You're also not really their banker, so there's no need for you to necessarily transfer funds outside, but it's got to go back to him in cash. The moment you cut a check or e-transfer it back to him, you've just money laundered. So really, really important that any refunds or any refunds that are made relating to cash goes back in cash as well.
Before, Stephen, you jump to your next scenario, I'm just going to point out or sorry, respond to a couple of the questions in the chat about whether this is a physical ink on paper process or possible to do digitally. It would be the process is meant to be kind of ink and paper. We're dealing with physical cash, so it is not outside the realm to obtain that pen and paper signature at that point in time. And that's basically why it's contemplated with the kind of an old school duplicate carbon copy cash receipt book. That said, we have seen practices where your duplicate receipt can be computer generated, but we would still want to see the signature itself. In some more original form, unless one of the things we've seen is if someone has a receipt book where they're literally signing in person at that point in time on, say, a digital, like one of those, like an iPad or a screen, you're signing and then you're creating the duplicate receipt. So right then and there, you need to generate the receipt and provide it to that party. And so there are limited means where there could be some digital or computerized ways around that if that's the type of practice you have, but you can't be getting that digital signature other than at the moment when you're receiving the cash. So it's meant to be a, you give me the cash, I get your signature, kind of 1-2 step process. And so that's where it is usually done in that way. But like I said, as we get more automated with even collecting documents and providing them, you could have digital processes as a part of that, but they would be limited and very specific. And again, you'd want to make sure it's at that same time that you're receiving the cash. Okay.
Perfect. Yeah, and I think too, a point to mention too is a lot of the cash receipt books don't necessarily list out what needs to be or what's required by the rules. So we've actually seen some members across Alberta and the Yukon that have actually contracted printing companies to create a customized cash receipt book that has all the requirements as set in the LSY rules, and we've seen that work. We've seen that work quite well. So that's another option in your arsenal just to help make sure you're getting everything that's required.
I'll just answer a couple more questions here about how do you get the cash back to them? And I would ask, how did you get the cash from them? And so it should be that back and forth question from Christiana about they're in another province in jail. How do you get them that $3? It can be more difficult than not to get them that cash in that scenario. But if it's a long-term situation, then you may be holding those funds for a moment until they're back and able to get the cash from you. Um, and then that's just a monitoring process with you and kind of time stamping or sorry, date stamping somewhere in your diary when that person may be around to receive the cash and try to get that to them. And then another question here, are bank drafts and money orders a possibility? Those are considered non-cash and so definitely received and handled in the normal course with any other general or trust funds, depending on which they are for the law practice.
Perfect. Okay. So last scenario here, and this is kind of time back to my first scenario where your client Cora is currently in jail, and again, her mother Melissa provides you with $30,000 cash, a cash retainer to cover legal fees and bail. As of file closing, there's still $3,000 left in that trust matter that you have to refund. Who should you refund in this situation? Would it be A, Cora, your client, B, Melissa, the one who provided the cash? Would you split 50-50 between Cora and Melissa? Or D, is it kind of unknown? And I'll just give everybody a moment just to put that in the chat. And then Christiana, written instructions. The answer is unknown. It really depends on, and to go back to Jaden's first point on prohibitions and conditions, it really ties back to making sure you have a very robust retainer agreement that sort of talks about what to do in these kind of situations. Just so to honestly to protect you as the member themselves, you could be providing cash into another person's trust matter, and they could think that that cash is them, so they would want the refund. It just helps to absolve you of any sort of potential issues down the line, especially relating to these third parties providing money, whether it be cash or not cash. It's the matter of who does that get refunded to, and that should really be documented in that initial retainer agreement.
Thank you, Stephen. And I will go back to the chat again. And there was one question from Lee that you have your client, and since leaving the cash with you, he leaves, he wants his money ASAP. That is not your immediate concern. Your concern is following the rules and what is required of you as a member. as I think Stephen mentioned earlier, you're not a banker. If they chose to pay you in cash and then they choose to disappear, that is not within your control. The rules require you to refund to that party in cash, and that's why a lot of practices try to avoid cash and or have a hard no cash rule because it is more difficult and onerous for you to meet the requirements of the rules in some cases. And so I know that once you have the money, you'd like to get rid of it if it's no longer a client and you'd like to keep your records clean, which we also love. However, when these scenarios happen, then you need to still be compliant with the rules. If you have a very extenuating circumstance, that's where consulting with the Law Society, getting that practice advice can be helpful for one-off scenarios. But I would say 99.9% of the time, the rule holds that the cash needs to go back to that client and that the client needs to make that happen. Just like they found a way to get you the cash, they will find a way to get that cash back. I find most people do like getting their money back if they're not using it and don't need those legal services any longer. If it's a matter of the client has moved to another law firm and has an active matter with them, then and or that law firm's rendered a bill, you are able to transition the funds to another law firm for the purposes of paying professional fees. But again, that you would want to make sure that you had documentation from that law firm and indication from the client that they were on board. So you can, from member to member, deal with that as well. I see another question up in the chat. Client passes away with a will. Can you give cash to the executor? And again, before grant of probate. So if you have the appropriate document that tells you that this is the person to deal with in lieu of the client that gave you the cash, then yes, we have actually seen that. And that is an appropriate way to get the cash over to the estate in that situation. Absolutely. And so that takes us through the content that we have for today, and we appreciate you spending your lunch hour with us to go through these rules. They are really important, and that's nationally. So it's not just in the Yukon that you're faced with these requirements. It's members across Canada, and it's not just lawyers as well. We as professional accountants have requirements to identify clients in order to electronically file documentation, say with the CRA, and there are many other. Lenders, financial institutions have similar requirements for identification, and so it is an overall mandate for a lot of us dealing with funds, dealing with clients and their funds, and it helps make sure that everybody's dealing with things on the up and up. Even nationally, Canada is currently modifying and updating their anti-money laundering and they have a whole much longer acronym than we do for dealing with that. So it is an ongoing set of rules, and it gets updated as wrongdoers find different ways to do things. Unfortunately, rules are modified and adapted to make sure we're catching as many, if not all of those scenarios as possible. So we do have time. We left time available for questions, and so please keep throwing those up in the chat. I will just indicate again, the question was, where do we find those forms? Lost Study of Yukon, and again, these slides will be provided to you and or posted on the website. This webinar has been recorded for you to reference back to, but the link is here in the slide, and it brings you right to the client identification and verification page of the Yukon Lost Study of Yukon's website. As well, rules are here. The sample forms are about halfway down our page here, and there are some additional forms if you're doing a dual method and credit file process, or if you're looking at getting an agreement with an agent for verification purposes. All that good information is there. The other website that is available that has a ton of resources and has a much lengthier course on following the rules, exceptions, and examples, and that's with the Federation of Law Societies. And they have a lot of different documents, tips, risk advisories, frequently asked questions, walking through scenarios, lots of really great information on dealing with the rules, why we have these model rules, and what that all means. So lots of really great information there, and they are constantly updating and providing that information for you. And it's the nice thing is they're free, and we all enjoy that resources that are fulsome and available at no cost. And so. Those are two excellent places to get information. And of course, as always, talking to Jessica and Linda there at the Law Study of Yukon, they're very informed and available to answer those questions. And as are we when we're there auditing and or even outside of that time frame, available to assist with those questions. So we'll pause. If there are some questions, I will just look through the chat here quickly. And otherwise, thank you so much for your time today, everyone. If you're zipping out, appreciate your participation and attendance. Okay, I see a question from Luke. What are the most common and serious mistakes we see lawyers make in client ID and verification? Well, Luke, right off the top, it's not doing it. We do a lot of audits, and we'll see members that have a lot of IDs photocopied, scanned into their files, and no identification form. And that's where our earlier takeaway was, as we're kind of putting the cart before the horse there. The preliminary step is completing the identification form. And so we want to make sure that that documentation first gets into the file before you're even needing to verify. Not bad to have the ID, but we do want to make sure in all instances that we are doing that identification, which is the documentation step. That's probably the most common thing we see. Second up is not completing the form in its entirety. And I think that's just, in a lot of cases, it's what I would call an innocent mistake, is a lot of members tried to put the information, the ID forms into their practice, and they were making best efforts to complete it, but they weren't completing all of those forms. And so what the Federation's direction is, none of those spots that are required should be blank. And as Stephen and Jaden noted, just document when it's not applicable, document when there's an extenuating circumstance, document your judgment or what you found. So all those little pieces help make sure it's a complete form, show that you did your complete due diligence and that there's no issue with you working with this client. Paul, good question. There will be a recording of this presentation available, so you can revisit any of what we talked about today, as well as the PowerPoint slides will be provided in PDF for you to reference back to.